The year is 1967, and Tsuburaya is coming off pretty strong from their excellent 1-2 punch of Ultra Q and Ultraman in the previous year. After that run, Tsuburaya needed a break to regroup and think about their next project. The Tokyo Broadcasting System, TBS for short, aired Captain Ultra directly following Ultraman as a filler series to tide over viewers. Oh, you've never heard of Captain Ultra? Well, don't worry about it. It was just made by a little company called Toei. It's really not that important. After Captain Ultra concluded, Tsuburaya came back to deliver some more of their artisanally crafted, homegrown tokusatsu, the kind Grandma used to make. And in this time between shows, Eiji and the boys were able to take some time and put together a proper successor to their legendary Ultraman, something that people would remember for decades after. See, the Science Patrol was actually a favorite element of Ultraman to Tsuburaya's team. They decided to base their new show, called Ultra Guard, entirely around the Patrol and their adventures, protecting the Earth from various threats from space or otherwise. This plan for the show would be heavily inspired by Eiji Tsuburaya's own love for Western TV shows like Mission Impossible and Thunderbirds. TBS and other sponsor Takeda Pharmaceutical urged Tsuburaya to make the themes for the show a bit more adult-oriented, kind of spice it up a little bit, so as to widen their audience for the coming show. And this new Ultra Guard concept suited that pretty perfectly. At some point into pre-production, though, it was decided that the show should still feature a superheroic element for the kids. And so Ultra Guard developed into Ultra Eye, which would feature Dan Moriboshi, a man who would transform into a hero that could become either big or small depending on the situation. Eventually, both concepts actually got kind of mashed together, creating Ultraseven. To make a long essay very short, Ultraseven really rounds out the opening trilogy of Tsuburaya's Ultra series by being a pretty ingenious fusion of Ultra Q and Ultraman. You have the action and long-running teen development of Ultraman smashed together with the darker, mysterious nature of Ultra Q, making for a show that's very much a thematic sequel to both shows, while also being pretty unique and outstanding on its own. I think this best of both worlds approach is what makes the show so incredibly beloved to this day. Ultraseven is actually kind of more popular than Ultraman in Japan, as a character, and more popular than the actual show that kicked off its own series. And that's just because of how good it is, and how much it captivated the audience of its time, and how they held on to the show as it moved on decades past. I just really can't emphasize enough just how important this show is. And having just seen the show for the first time, I can tell you it's the real deal. There are episodes of Ultraseven that are so good that they make you feel like you're rediscovering Toku or even Sci-Fi for the first time all over again. The cultural footprint this thing had in Japan, too, I mean, it was massive. I mean, look at this. Not one, but two giant references in famous Shonen Jump manga. And I bet that's not even scratching the surface. Part of what makes Ultraseven feel so bold and interesting is the fact that it's not really playing with a steadfast set of rules. Ultra Q was a show that was kind of playing it close to shows like Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits. That's a pretty open premise with a wide array of possibilities, but it also cuts out some of that really fantastical hero action you'd get in something like Ultraman. So, in Ultra Q, when it's dealing with the big monsters and the like, because big monsters are popular, it mainly deals with the threats in a way that a kaiju movie would. That's not exactly a bad thing, as that can go a few different ways, but it's something that people have seen before and would expect when there's no hero present. You know, tanks firing at monsters and the like, that kind of. In a similar way, Ultraman is playing by a more typical episodic superhero premise. Every episode will end in the giant fight. It's a foregone conclusion. Giant fights will happen. Now, what happens in that fight could mean a few different things, but it's something that people will expect on a consistent basis. And because it's not quite in that Twilight Zone realm like with Ultra Q, Ultraman doesn't really go all the way into being super dark or serious, And while it definitely does get complicated and plays with its format in a way that creates some of my favorite episodes of TV ever, it only ever does that towards the end. So it's not throughout. It kind of had to find its footing first and establish its format. So then we have Ultraseven, a show taking a lot from spy fiction, playing with high tension and mixing that with some dark theming that it inherits from Ultra Q. In Ultraman, a lot of the threats boil down to something akin to a group of specialists dealing with a bear or some other type of large animal wandering into town. The monsters in Ultraman are very much treated as beings that don't really know better. There are obviously a couple of exceptions, like Baltans or Zetons, but for every one of those guys, there are like 5 Red Kings or Gamoras. In Ultraseven, our threats are conscious of the damage they're doing. They want to destroy us. When that feeling is so consistent, it changes the mood in a pretty considerable way. There's also just the simple fact that Seven is able to do several different things from Ultraman. I mean, look at his design. Super good stuff. He kind of feels more like a warrior than Ultraman, especially with that armor on his shoulders and chest. And he can also solve problems human-sized as well as giant-sized. And there's also that iconic fin on his head. That thing is actually called an Ice Slugger, and it's kind of like a boomerang knife that he can use to make quick work of aliens. And boy does this change some of these fights. Ultraman never really had a weapon, which is totally cool because all of his beams and other tricks are so damn cool. Those poses are famous for a reason after all. But the simple fact of giving Seven a weapon, and a pretty grisly one at that, makes a lot of these fights feel more dangerous, more visceral. I mean, imagine seeing a fight in person, right? 2 dudes kind of wrestling with each other is one thing, but then if one dude pulls out a knife, it gets pretty serious at that point. Also, Ultraseven, I'd be remiss to not mention that he has these pupils in his eyes, and for the longest time I thought these pupils kind of looked goofy, but I think in the context of the show, it doesn't really change, but they just kind of feel like pretty expressive of his character. I don't know. I don't really know exactly how to describe it, but the pupils, they've grown on me. I still prefer the classic kind of light bulb eyes of the original Ultraman and other Ultras like him, but I do like the pupils. I don't mind them. I don't want to make it seem like Seven is cruel or overdoing it, though, with the knife, because these aliens kind of call for it. There really is a bigger sense of danger in this show, and it's down to that intent given by a lot of the villains. There's more dialogue given to them, so it makes these fights feel like a battle of the wills, a battle between someone fighting on our behalf and someone trying to destroy everyone and everything we know. Seven still maintains some of that optimism from Ultraman, though, so there's always kind of a sort of hope that things could possibly turn out differently, that some of these guys could back off, and that does happen actually a couple times. So when there's that kind of genuine mix of emotions going on, it's seriously triumphant when Seven wins on our behalf, but it's also a huge shame whenever things have to go that far. Ultraseven's all about that mix of emotions, and that's really brought home by the incredible cast. The Ultra Guard, led by the stern and fair, but compassionate Captain Kiriyama, is a great follow-up to the SSSP from Gridman. The SSSP were more of a group of specialists in the field, whereas the Ultra Guard are kind of more of that team you'd see in one of the spy shows that Eiji Tsuburaya apparently loves so much. They're a bit more action-oriented. Our team includes Furuhashi, played by the same Sandayu Dokumamushi that played Arashi in the original Ultraman, basically reprising his role as the resident hard-headed action man, and Yuri, who is the team's nurse, and apparently someone that just knows so many of the one-off characters in each episode. You know, go her, she's great. And then there's also Soga, the team's sharpshooter, and Amagi, the Ultra Guard's tactician, who's also played by Bin Furia, the suit actor for Ultraman in the previous year. Ain't that a hoot? Rounding out the team is Dan Moroboshi, who is introduced to the team in the first episode. Dan Moroboshi is Ultraseven, and this time I don't mean he's the host, like with Shin in the last show. No, Dan Moroboshi literally is Ultraseven in disguise as a human. He was originally sent out to map the galaxy, but he quickly fell in love with Earth, and while visiting Earth, he saved the life of a man called Jiro Satsuma, whose bravery inspired Dan to use his likeness as his disguise on Earth. He quickly gets along with the team after the first episode and begins to give himself selflessly to the mission of protecting the Earth and its people. Dan keeps his identity secret, however, so he can better help the Guard along without having them completely rely on his powers as Seven, messing with the development of the Earth as its own independent planet. Kind of like the Prime Directive from Star Trek. This quickly makes for a really great dynamic where Dan is both a fish out of water and a lot of the time the only guy in the room that actually knows what's going on. There are a lot of scenes in this show where the Ultra Guard is trying to figure out something that is going on, where an alien is causing something bizarre to happen, but Dan's inner monologue actually lets us know that he's actually very aware of what's happening, but he can't explain it to his friends. These moments where the show clues us in through Dan's thoughts are actually some of my personal favorite moments of some episodes. It's just some really great stuff. There's a fine line to walk here, too, when it comes to doing this sort of protagonist rather than the usual host dynamic that, spoiler alert, a lot of Ultra series go for. That fine line is making sure that the protagonist doesn't cross over into condescending territory, making him feel out of step emotionally with the viewer. Thankfully, this never really happens, as Dan is actually incredibly compassionate and goofy and friendly and just altogether wonderful. Ultraseven really makes you absolutely fall in love with the guy, and he's just so entertaining to watch, and while I adore Ultraman, adore it, it's one of my favorite shows, and I really think this is one area where Seven kind of has a clear leg up on it. Shin Hayata, he's fun, but he's not nearly as exciting as some of the folks he shares scenes with, like Ide. Totally fine with me, as the show is still incredibly strong for it. I prefer it to the reverse, where a main character overshadows everyone else around him. And that doesn't really happen either in Seven. The other members in the Ultra Guard are actually very capable of carrying themselves in scenes with Dan, never feeling overshadowed, outside of maybe the first couple episodes of show when the show is still trying to sell you on the whole dynamic. I mentioned a conflict of feelings within Ultra 7 earlier, and that's because this show deals pretty directly with the drawbacks and consequences of progression, particularly scientific advancement, and how mankind's reckless forward momentum can leave behind a trail of destruction. Humanity is a kind, beautiful, priceless thing, but it's also responsible for an endless amount of pain and misery, and Ultra 7 does a lot to reckon with that. I mean, for God's sakes, episode 21 features Ultra 7 literally fighting a weird zombified version of the battleship Yamato, a famous symbol for Japanese imperialism. Holy shit. There's another episode that is banned from television as of 2011, where two Ultra Guard scientists are creating a devastating weapon capable of destroying planets. A few years before Star Wars, by the way. A full decade, actually. Jesus Christ. Which then incurs the wrath of a monster, who comes to Earth for revenge, bearing radioactive ash with it. The show ain't subtle. And it's very much making the argument that we need to watch ourselves before we become the very same evildoers that threaten the sanctity of fellow civilizations. There are times our heroes utterly fail at this too, like with the episode about the non-malt, an Earth civilization that predated humans pushed out to the sea by our species, whose entire civilization is destroyed due to misunderstandings and hard feelings. This theming comes to a head in the downright incredible Nightmare on the Fourth Planet, directed by the incomparable Akio Jisoji, an episode about the way that this reckless scientific progression could grow to dehumanize us and destroy any trace of human flaw, illustrated by an absolutely terrifying trip through a society that mirrors some of the worst, most inhumane moments in actual human history. I won't give away the whole episode, but it's just one of the greatest episodes of television I've ever fucking seen, and it'll stick with me for years afterward. It, like a lot of the theming in the show, is just simply ahead of its time, and it's just jaw-dropping how spot-on some of the show's speculations have held up over 50 years after its airing. I don't want to risk over-explaining the show. It's a masterpiece. We know this, alright, class? Just agree with... Yes, it's a masterpiece. And I think that it's obvious at this point to anyone that cares about Tokusatsu, or hell, even Sci-Fi in general, that it's a must-watch. It's available on Blu-ray for like 20 fucking bucks on Amazon. Go buy it. It's amazing. The series is incredibly solid, through to the end. And I haven't even brought up its arguably most famous episode, or the banned episode, though these could honestly deserve their own videos. I think before I get too carried away, though, I'll close out by talking about Ultraseven as the ending to this opening trilogy of Ultra shows. When Eiji Tsuburaya started his production company, he was coming off of some incredible success from his work on Toho's kaiju films, including the timeless Godzilla. When Ultra Q started, Japan was in the middle of a pretty big sci-fi and kaiju boom. At the time, there was so much faith put into the guy's work that Ultra Q was the most expensive television show ever made at the time of its release. Audiences were held captive by the show's knack for great episodic storytelling and dark premises, indulging people in some of their fears in a pretty uncertain era of history. And then with Ultraman, Tsuburaya pushed those viewers into the light of a new day, showing them the beauty of the unfamiliar. Ultraman told the story of a vast godly presence providing comfort to humanity in peril. But not only that, Ultraman also teaches humanity to use their most brilliant gift, ingenuity, to conquer their fears, create peace on Earth, and hopefully provide that same comfort to others sometime down the line. Ultraseven in turn provides some extra food for thought on top of this contrast created by the two shows before it. Ultraseven provides warnings that humanity can use their gift in dark, horrible ways that it already has before in its most regretful days. Ultraseven is a show that presents its Ultra as not just humanity's friend and caretaker, but as indistinguishable from humanity itself. Ultraseven isn't quite a god in disguise, but rather just one of us with the power to help. Ultraseven presents Dan as not something so beyond us, but rather humanity's future, our aspirational goal. This show is a stern warning that we should exercise caution and not be the kind of people that advances recklessly, the kind of people that intends or causes harm to the world and people around us. Dan is graceful and wise at the ground level, and instills these values in a powerful way. It's not just that we could hope to be as good as Dan, it's that we can and often are as good as Dan. We just have to keep it up. Notice that this kinda sounds similar to how I described Yusuke Godai in Kuga. That character could be described as Joe Odagiri doing a Dan Moroboshi impression. I don't know that I'd say that, but you know. Humanity, progress, empathy, kindness. It's a marathon. We have to keep it up and go at a careful pace to make sure we can make it to that finish line. To peace on Earth, to prosperity for everyone. Even in the darkest and most hopeless of times, if we can keep at that pace, we will make it. This is a grand statement by a timeless body of work, and for it, Eiji Tsuburaya, Tsuburaya Productions, and everyone else that worked on these shows should be proud. After Ultraseven ended in 1968, the folks that made the Ultra series went on their separate ways. Some of the team went on to create Operation Mystery to capitalize on the burgeoning horror and mystery boom in Japan. Eiji Tsuburaya, however, went on to create Mighty Jack, the show that he would actually personally consider his magnum opus. Eiji Tsuburaya passed away in 1970. Before Eiji's death, the Ultra series was a closed loop. Although they weren't connected, and it may not have even been intentional, there was a powerful thematic through line, an intimate conversation about humanity that made up the backbone of the entire trilogy. The thing about this, though, is that connection for these three is kind of always somewhat possible, and even if the series was complete, it ended open enough that future iterations on the series wouldn't be a complete and total slap in the face. So, when Eiji passed away in 1970, and his son Hajime took over the company, it was only natural what happened next. Ultraman Returned. Alright, and that is the first Explode When Defeated of 2020. All done, wrapped up, in the can. I'm really excited about this one. I'm super proud of it. I feel like I get really, really jazzed about all of my Ultra episodes, mainly just because this is pretty new for me. I'm a pretty new fan of Ultra, but also I don't see too much talk about it on YouTube outside of like Vintage Henshin and maybe like a couple other like videos here and there. So I definitely feel like I'm not saying I'm the bastion or the patron saint of Ultra here, but I want to do my part because this is amazing stuff and everyone should check it out. And yeah, so there's new episodes of Discuss All Monsters every month, around the middle of the month or so. Sometimes I can fluctuate. Next episode is going to be about Kamen Rider Phase. I'm pretty sure. Could change, but I'm fairly certain it's going to be Phase, and that one is going to be pretty interesting, so definitely stay tuned for that. And yeah, I'm not really sure that there are many other updates or anything, but just want to say hey to you guys. Hope you guys had a happy new year, even though it's the end of January now, but I really appreciate you guys sticking around, and there's a lot of really great stuff coming up this year, I think. I've kind of looked at the shows I'm hoping to tackle this year, and there's a lot of cool shit, so I really hope you guys stick around and have some fun and share it with your friends and stuff like that. So thanks for watching. Bye-bye.